In this video, we are going to talk about how to effectively use the 4K on the Canon M50. Now, as we all know, the Canon M50 is not a great camera for doing 4K video. There's a lot of limitations, and so in order to make this video as concise and useful as possible, I'm going to enumerate the 4 biggest problems and then talk about solutions to those problems. Problem number 1 is crop. The M50 has a 1.7 times crop when you switch it over into 4K. Now, that is on top of the 1.6 times crop that the M50 naturally has because it's a crop sensor APS-C size sensor. And when you add 1.7 crop to 1.6 crop, you end up with a 2.72 times crop. That's more than the Nikon one, which that system's dead. This is the problem that you'll most readily recognize when you switch to 4K on the M50. It goes from this in 1080p to this in 4K. Next, we have autofocus, which this is the most annoying to me because they could have had Canon's legendary dual pixel autofocus in 4K and they didn't. They just decided that they didn't want to do that because it might cut into their higher end lines. Number 3 is one I don't hear talked about much, and that is the terrible rolling shutter on the M50. Number 4, and this is another one that you don't hear talked about very much, is editing, and editing 4K is a whole different animal than editing 1080p. The reason that I actually haven't made a video on the 4K yet is because my old computer couldn't edit it at all. Thank you so much. Absolutely. You too. Let's real quick readjust this. That's better. So what I suppose we need to start is at the very beginning, and that's how to switch it into 4K. Now, there are 2 ways to do this. One is going into your menu, going to frame rate, and then choosing the 4K 23.97 frames per second. The other way of doing it is hitting the Q button or the quick menu, and that brings up a overlay menu on your screen, and from there you can access the frame rate, switch it all the way from 720p at 60 frames a second to 4K at 23.97. or 24 frames per second. I'm going to say 24p or 24 frames per second for the rest of this video. I'm not going to keep saying 23.97. Now, that of course is the first thing that you need to do in order to shoot in 4K, but one thing, and this maybe should have been number 1, is look at what type of memory card you have. You need a U3 memory card in order to use the 4K on the M50. You had to have a card that's fast enough to write those high data files. You can have a memory card that is 85 megabits per second, but if it is a U1 card, it will not work. But then you can have a SD card that is a 90 megabits per second U3 card, and that will make all of the difference in the world. Now, since we're shooting in 4K, another thing that we can do is shoot flatter. So in this video, I am using CineStyle for most of, if not all of these segments. But one thing you definitely want to do, if you haven't already, is switch your profile from the standard or auto profile. I have always found that if you look at this image, this is the automatic mode, and personally, I think this looks like garbage. If this is the only way that you could shoot with the M50, I wouldn't, because it looks terrible. So I would immediately switch it to something like neutral, and this, if you want a grab and go file, is the perfect blend of contrast and saturation. Or if you want to color grade more, then CineStyle. But keep in mind with CineStyle, you need to expose a little bit higher because everything will look brighter, and when you bring down the shadows in post, you're going to realize that it wasn't actually overexposed, it just looked like it a little bit on your screen. Another thing that you want to do before shooting video with the M50 is switch it into the movie mode. Now, unfortunately, when I've said manual movie mode in the past, a lot of people have thought that I meant M on the mode dial, but no, you want to switch it to the video on the mode dial. Then if you see up at the top of corner of the screen or the first option of the first tab of the menu, you can switch between automatic movie mode and manual movie mode, and you want to be within the manual movie mode on the movie mode icon on the dial. And what that does for you is it gives you just the options for shooting video. Next, because the 4K has terrible autofocus, you need to go into the menus and turn off autofocus. Or if your camera is straight out of the box, do you see this AF/MF button? You can click that to toggle between autofocus and manual focus. That is all the menu settings that I would change right off of the bat. As you learn more about your camera and mess with it more, you will figure out different settings that you will want to change. I have videos on a lot of that stuff, and you can go back and watch them if you're looking for more information on that. But basically, out of the box, to shoot 4K, those are the things that you want to change. Now let's get into the meat and potatoes, which is dealing with the issues of the M50's 4K. Number one is, again, that crop. That crop is very extreme. What you want to do is you want to think about it in those terms. Figure out what is the distance you want to be from your subject to get the compression that you would like to achieve. I will link to the video talking about lens compression, and that goes in depth into what I'm talking about with lens compression and distance to your subject. And then you need to choose the lens to get the framing that you want. What you're basically going to have to do in order to combat that crop is shoot with wider lenses. Another thing you can do is use the speed booster. That will take it down from about a 2.7 crop to a 1.9 crop. Not perfect, but it is a lot better. And then you can adapt over full frame EF lenses, or as what I'm doing right now, crop sensor EF lenses. Now, keep a note, I say EF, not EFS. There's actually a difference between Canon's EF mount and EFS mount. The EFS mount has a little tab off of the back, so lenses like the 10-18 will not work on the speed booster. You have to get a pass-through adapter for those. But lenses like what I'm using right now, which is the Tokina 11-16mm f2.8, that lens is an EF mount APS-C lens. Now, when you have it in 1080p, you can see the little circle around here. That is called a vignette, and that is because it's a lens that's made for a crop sensor camera. But something that shooting in 4K does for us is, because it makes the image circle smaller, you can use the EF mount APS-C lenses with the speed booster on the M50. So it's sort of this weird finagling way of using those crop sensor lenses, but it actually works well. So if you're using the M50 in 4K, getting the speed booster, you can get some of the cheaper APS-C lenses that will work on this camera. Now, this lens in particular is not the best lens for the M50 because the autofocus is terribly loud. But that's actually one reason I decided to get this lens. The GH5, as we know, has bad autofocus, and the M50, as we know, has bad autofocus in 4K. So I'm not going to be using autofocus with either of those, and as I'm using 4K more in my workflow, and wanting to use 4K on the M50, but feeling limited by the focal lengths that I already had, the widest being 15mm, this allows me to get a wider field of view than I otherwise could have with the kit lens. You do not need something that is wider than, say, 35mm. That's relatively easy to get. You can get lenses like, say, a 12mm manual lens that when you do the 2.7 times crop is roughly about a 30mm lens. Or if you're trying to get something like an 80mm, you could get a 30mm lens down in the description. So check out those links if you're in the market for lenses or other camera equipment. One thing you want to keep in mind when you are picking out a lens to use with the 4K is picking out a lens that has a good manual focus experience. This lens has a terrible autofocus experience, but it actually has a pretty good manual focus experience. When you work the action to turn this onto manual, you have hard stops on either ends, and the lens focuses exactly the same every single time. The M50's kit lens is a terrible experience when trying to use manual focus, so I would look for something that's made to have more of a tactile and not just a focus by wire. If you could find something like this, or a lot of the USM Canon lenses, they have a much better manual focusing experience. Now, when you're manual focusing, there are two ways to help you get critical focus. One is focus peaking, and this is more for getting fast focus. So you see on the screen here that there are red lines over your subject, but that's not the best way to manual focus on the M50. What you want to do is right here you see this focus button. You click on that, and then if you roll the scroll wheel at the top, you can zoom in 5 or 10 times. You can move this anywhere around the screen, and that will allow you in a much more precise way than with the focus peaking or eyeing it alone. The next problem that you're going to run into is the rolling shutter on this camera. And look at this. It's atrocious. This is terrible. And the reason for this is the way that these cameras process the image from top to bottom. So every image is being taken from top down to the bottom, and the amount of rolling shutter is based upon how fast your processor is able to read the information off of those sensors. And so the bottom of the image is recorded a split second after the top is, and that is what causes the rolling shutter effect, or jello effect as it used to be called until rolling shutter caught on YouTube, and now everyone just calls it rolling shutter. You will not be able to solve this problem, but longer lenses have a worse problem. So another reason why I use wide angle lenses is that you will see more rolling shutter. It won't technically be worse, you'll just see it more with longer lenses. And then the only other thing that I know of that you can do is keep your movement slow so that the rolling shutter is not noticeable. So you don't want to do a lot of fast whips, fast pans, anything like that. You want to do slower movements, and that will keep the rolling shutter down to non-noticeable level. And finally, we come down to the real reason that I haven't used the M50's 4K very much up to this point, and that's editing. I had a 5-year-old laptop with 8 gigabytes of RAM and not a very good graphics processing unit, and an old program that couldn't even edit 4K. My computer couldn't even play back 4K. 1080p was the maximum, and it struggled with that. And that's something that people don't think about, and I know that people don't really talk about until they start trying to use 4K, is that it takes a lot more of a toll on your system. From my research, I found out that it's very confusing when you're trying to figure out if something is usable for 4K or not. And so what I would say on this issue is do your due diligence. I will link down in the description the laptop that I just got for my video editing, and so far it has been able to chew through and spit out all of the 4K that I've thrown at it. Though I don't have an editing program that can do 10-bit yet, so might struggle a bit when I start using 10-bit from the GH5. But for the 8-bit 4K, I have not actually had any issue with it. Now that brings us to editing software. And if I was starting out right now, probably the editing software that I would use is DaVinci Resolve. Unfortunately, I will not be switching to DaVinci Resolve, at least not anytime soon, because the workflow on DaVinci Resolve is so different than the Vegas Movie Studio that I have been using. I tried to use it for 2 hours. It was so frustrating, so much different, just different than what I was used to, that I gave up and I went back. I actually really like using the Vegas Movie Studio. I've been using that since it was Sony Movie Studio, which the version I have been done most of the videos on this channel with is Sony Movie Studio 12. And now I'm using Vegas Movie Studio 17, and that's all I really have to say on editing is do your due diligence and figure out what you actually need for editing 4K. Don't get a camera thinking that you'll be able to edit the footage from it and then find out that your computer can't handle it, because that happens to a lot of people, including me. Well, that is it for this video. I hope you found it helpful. If you did, please give me a like. Subscribe to the channel for more content like this. Please use those links down in the description if you're planning on buying any of the gear that I've talked about in this video, or any gear period. If you use those Amazon links and buy anything from Amazon, I get a kickback, so that would be much appreciated. Also, you can hit the little applause button if you want to directly donate to the channel. Thank you for watching this video, and I'll see you all in the next one.